Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar covering cultural competency. Thank you for being early, as usual. We're going to go ahead and give just a few more minutes for those who are still joining or planning to join at 6 o'clock. In the meantime, if you have any questions that you would like to go over near the beginning of tonight's lesson, please feel free to send us a message, and myself or Carol will get back to you. So I had one of our students ask a very important question. They were asking about the surveys that you all receive at the end of the lesson. And they were asking if those surveys are mandatory. And they are not mandatory. You do not have to take them, but they really do help us out a lot. We actually put a lot of effort and time into conducting the analysis of those surveys, and it's a great way for you to kind of talk to us about the program. It's an excellent way for us to understand how everyone is receiving our program. Simply because you can tell me, you can message me what you like about the program, what you don't like, where you have a bad day, where you have a good day, and we take that into account definitely. But it's just a different perspective. It's a different way. It gives us a different kind of window into how our programs are received, and we can see it in the form of that aggregated data from those surveys. So no reason you have to do them, just very helpful, much appreciated. Okay, everyone. Before we get started, let me just take a few short minutes to address some of the questions that I've received. So if you're having audio issues, please let me know if you can go ahead and hear me right now. My audio should be firing off and working. Secondly, someone asked which class number this is, and this should be, give me one moment, and we'll have that information for you. So counting the orientation, this should be our 6th class. We've covered the skills training, the mental health basics, part 1 and 2 of sharing your story, and today we'll be covering cultural competency. So that would be, like I said, class number 6. And finally, someone asked a very important question is, should you have heard from your local NAMI yet? No, if you have, that's great, but you should not, it's not mandatory for them to have reached out to you by now. They're still kind of wrapping up with a previous cohort participants. And kind of the way it's working out is the way this month is ending. We're moving into the next fiscal year for our affiliate, for the California State affiliate, and most of the other local ones are as well. So we're kind of just wrapping up some of the reporting as we transition into a new accounting year. So no, if you have received some type of contact from your local affiliate, that's great. If you haven't, please don't be worried. You still have plenty of time. We still have the rest of June and all of July that we'll still be going over different topics and lessons. And in that time, you'll be reached out by that local affiliate who will go over your career goals. So please don't worry if that is concerning you. Okay, I think that kind of wraps up those questions. So again, as mentioned, today's class will be covering cultural competency. It'll be brought to you by myself, Jonathan, and my wonderful co-presenter, Carol, is back with us again this week. You want to go ahead and give us a little shout out, Carol?
Yeah, hello everyone. Sorry I was sick last week, but I'm well now. So I'm happy to be back.
Oh, I don't think you need to apologize whatsoever for that, Carol. Please don't worry.
All right.
Went a little far. Okay, so this is what I'd like to cover for today's objectives. Generally, we would like to define culture, considering that we'll be talking about that to a great deal, and that will be necessary foundation to talk about cultural competence in that same vein. We'll go over diversity, the definition, how organizations can accomplish that, and then we'll wrap it all up by talking about inclusion and what that means at the organizational level and when you're conducting your own work with community members. All of this information that's presented to you is part of the Cultural and Linguistic Responsiveness Toolkit. This was designed in 2014 by NAMI California, the Union of Pan-Asian Communities, and Pacific Clinics. To put this project together as part of a 3-year project under the California Mental Health Services Authority that took place over January 2012 to 2014. And this project was created to assist local NAMI affiliates to begin to address disparities in the health status of people of diverse racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds. So yeah, UPAC partnered with statewide leaders who are experts in a variety of different diverse communities, racial, ethnic communities in California, and these individuals made up the Cultural Competency Steering Committee. So the creation of this committee and this component for the NAMI California Stigma and Discrimination Reduction Project was quite significant because it formalized these relationships with statewide cultural experts, including those from the MHSA-funded California Reducing Disparities Project. It's a pretty big project, been underway since 2012 as well. And this, most importantly, was NAMI California's first formal endeavor into a statewide effort to address cultural disparities. And we'll talk more as the lesson goes on about some of these different disparities in healthcare. It's actually a pretty well-researched topic, not just in California, but across the United States, that individuals that happen to be non-white or individuals who may not speak English typically do not have as positive health outcomes, or just different general trends. And we'll cover a little bit of that today, kind of how you can do, what you can do as someone who will be working as a frontline staff, helping peers and family members be aware of these differences and what you can do to address them. Okay, before we jump in, a quick little example of that I would like to start with would be to wish everyone a happy Juneteenth. So today is Juneteenth. This is a little national celebration designed to celebrate the ending in actuality of slavery in the United States. So even though Abraham Lincoln, made the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, it had still not reached parts of the South during the Civil War. And as the Civil War is winding up, there are still people, individuals, African slaves in the South living in slavery during this time. And so Juneteenth is really to commemorate when a Union general made it to Galveston, Texas, and informed the slaves on that plantation of President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And so today, Juneteenth isn't always as well talked about in some different, school systems. It's kind of got a cultural roots in the South, and then during different migratory shifts in American history, kind of spread out into, parts of the Great Migration and after the Civil Rights Movement. And so you don't see kind of some of the same festivities. Myself, I'm from the South. I'm from Arkansas. And I was very lucky to be able to help out in some of our larger Juneteenth celebrations out there. And I just like to, make sure that people are aware of kind of this type of activity, this type of celebration, what it means to the history of the United States. And it also is a great way to practice being, inclusive in your own organization when you can be aware of certain holidays. We recently, for example, just saw the passing of Eid, which is the end of Ramadan for individuals who follow the Muslim faith. And so if you've been able to, thank any of your, your friends or other associates who may be familiar with that culture, it's always great just to, tell someone, Happy Eid or Eid Mubarak. And it's just one way. So moving forward, we're going to start off with just a little bit of an exercise. So what I would like everyone to practice doing is just take a quick 30 seconds to think about the image in front of you and just respond with some of the questions you see on the screen. So what culture or ethnicity I am. You don't need to answer all of them. This is meant to be a very quick exercise. So just go ahead and pick one of those questions and kind of say how you perceive that person. Just based off this simple little snapshot. And we'll share some of those responses, and we'll use that as an example to kind of demonstrate things like preconceived notion, bias, how that kind of affects most of human decision making. So we have a couple people responding in our comment section. So some people mention Pacific Islander as one of the ethnicities, English as a language, Asian, Filipino, API, male. Okay, so yeah, we all can kind of on pretty similar background when it comes to some of the demographic information, some of the language that we use to characterize people. So great. Thank you everyone for sharing. With that in mind, let's move on to our next slide. So same thing, just kind of going off the very, very shallow kind of visual cues that we can use. What are some of the questions? How would you answer some of these about the young person in front of you? So again, we go back to some ideas about language. So some people think that this individual may be an English speaker, that they appear to be feminine or female. So for a lot of people, as we think about identity, or specifically for identity for others, a lot of people tend to go to language. So they bring up English or the language that is spoken, European or white. Okay, fantastic. Some people even brought up potential sexual orientation. So that the individual may be non-binary, may be genderqueer, or simply queer when it comes to orientation. So good. So we're kind of thinking about these things on different levels. And for some of those who are responding to comments, again, some of these questions we're asking are simply about the individuals on the screen in front of you. We're not to the point in the lesson where we're going to go over our own self-identity. We're going on the identity of those on the PowerPoint in front of you. All right, fantastic. So let's move on. I believe this is the last kind of example of this within this activity. So finally, we'll just go over some, again, using some of those defining features. How would you conceptualize this individual's identity? So we have a couple people thinking, potentially male, of Native American background, or Hispanic background, potentially Mediterranean. So I mean, a little bit all over the place, fine. And that's again, that's kind of what this activity is meant to demonstrate. So yeah, a good mix. People kind of offering, a bunch of different backgrounds. Someone maybe from different geographic locations in the United States. Some context clues being some of the clothing he's wearing, for example, the necklace being potentially Native American. So good. So let's address your comments in a couple of ways for the three images. And by doing that, we're going to go ahead and kind of look into more depth about who these individuals are. So thank you for all your responses. This is for Ronnie and James. So all of these were part of our In Our Own Voice kind of campaign. It was an initiative by NAMI California to better hear from individuals, family members, and peers, so that we could do things like reduce stigma and get people's stories into the mainstream. And so that's where all of these individuals, their stories were collected from. On the left is James. James is currently 24 and is from Cerritos, California, and he identifies as a Korean American. James has been diagnosed with schizophrenia. The more difficult times that he had were actually the years right out of high school. In that time, he had ended up in a mental institution for a couple of weeks, and that experience was quite hard. He explained that he never experienced anything like that in his life previously, and he eventually ended up in boarding care afterwards. It was hard as well, but it was much easier to go out and see a different side compared to what the process was like in the institution. And it was a good feeling to have a little bit of that freedom. He came to accept when his brother James, so he came to accept it when his brother had told him that he might have schizophrenia. At some point, they'd gone to a doctor, Ronnie and James together, to talk a little bit more about his diagnosis. To this day, James says that the right counselors helped him a lot. He says he does not think he could have done it without them to fix the way that he communicates and to be more hopeful. Right now, his dreams include graduating college and to hopefully move on to a master's life, find a job, a career he enjoys, and cherish what good memories he has. So that is a little bit about Ronnie and James. Our next kind of participant was Jessica. So Jessica, she is 23 years old. She identifies as an individual who is white, who comes from a working class family. Her identity in regards to gender and sexual orientation are very important to her. At the moment, she identifies as queer/lesbian, mostly because her recent partner's gender shifted into being non-binary, gender queer. And so it kind of throws into flux that label of being a lesbian if her partner is, not identifying as a woman. And so in general, she finds queer to be a more helpful definition when it comes to her identity. She's experienced chronic worrying and anxiety for her entire life, as long as she can remember. At some point, she was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder as well as obsessive compulsive disorder. One of the most difficult times with her mental health was her senior year of college. She was writing 2 theses for her classes, and during that time, she fell into a really deep pit of depression, started having suicidal ideation, and was just in a very dark place. At that point, she reached out for additional help. She decided to integrate medication into her recovery plan. Her point of acceptance, she came to accept her mental health challenges as things that she had been born predisposed to, and not being something that was her fault or being something that she can control. For her, treatment looks like going to therapy every week, specifically with a therapist who is an expert in queer competency and taking medication for anxiety. Some of the most successful coping skills that she has used are breathing exercises and other types of meditative focus. Within her own community of other queer friends, she's been able to develop a pretty strong network, and that's helped her a lot to support her through her different mental health challenges. Right now, for Jessica, success to her means living well and living comfortably, and she means that materially, physically, mentally, and when it comes to her relationships. She says that feels like a radical aspiration for someone who is queer, who is a woman, and who has grew up in a low income and working class uh, environment, who has these mental health struggles. Survival and living well to me are what would mean that my life has been successful. So that was Jessica. And finally, we have Mr. Hector. So Hector here is 38 years old. He's the oldest of 5 siblings, including 2 sisters, an adopted brother, and adopted sister. He is actually a graduate student in Southern California where he is studying chemistry. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder 1 and at some point also with autism. He went for a long time, undiagnosed, trying to figure out what was exactly wrong with him, not knowing how to ask those questions, not knowing what to do to really seek that help. The moment for him that made him realize that he needed to reach out was when his mother went to visit him in the hospital after he'd made an attempt on his own life. And she had said that this is the last time that she'd be able to do this, and that she would not be able to continue coming back to him until he received some help. Some of the issues related for him, and when it comes to his own mental health journey, include being Native American. This process has affected him in that his family, they've never really been encouraged to go to the doctor as kind of like a cultural thing. They have a bit of a distrust, he says, for doctors, for Western medicine in some capacities, and just going to doctors on a regular basis has never been like instilled. The things that allow him to accept his illness was his mom. She was able to show him that, with her care, without his family, that he would be able to get through his challenges. If she can do it, I can do it, is what Hector says. And he defines success as the following: as being able to integrate those aspects of life that are big, things like school, family, work, relationships, his dog, and being able to bring them all together. Not to just juggle things anymore, but to embrace everything because he can do that. And that would be Mr. Hector. So part of that activity that we all just went over was kind of to talk about some of the factors, how we make decisions about other people, things like preconceived notions or biases. Because every day we meet strangers in our daily life. This might be in work, this may be on our way to the grocery store, this might be during vacations. Right away, most of us tend to make some types of conclusions based on this very brief, short, shallow interaction. In many cases, it's something that we cannot avoid doing. It's not something we can control. People would suggest that human beings experience an unconscious bias towards trying to make sense of the world around them. It's really, some people would say an evolutionary strategy, part of the human psyche. The problem with this is that it can prevent us from really getting to know a person, or it can prevent us from starting out on the right foot. So with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and segue a little bit now into talking about culture, where I believe Carol will take the handoff here.
Okay, we're going to just look at this question. What is culture? Excuse me while I clear my throat. But before we actually jump into being culturally competent, we want to look at exactly what does culture mean. So NAMI's definition. NAMI has a definition, actually. It is this. Culture refers to the customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group. It includes the set of shared attitudes, values, goals, and practices that characterize an institution or organizations. So that's an official definition from NAMI. But we want to look today at culture beyond just language and ethnicity, because as we know, culture expands to lots of other categories and includes such as age. So, you know, there's what we call the T group, transitional age youth. There's older adults. And then there's the LGBTQ community. There's another community of veterans and military families. Others are in a community of faith and spirituality. There's, we're looking at California here. There's rural and farm worker communities, especially in our state. There's people who are physically disabled. So they might have different communities based on their disability, like if they're deaf or if they're blind. And then there's poverty and socioeconomic status can separate people into their own culture, and gender, of course, and others. So we know that wherever you live throughout California, even cultures can vary from region to region. So we just want to be really cognizant of the communities that are in our area. And I'm sure some of you could share that kind of thing. Like I'm thinking the Central Valley is going to have certain communities that the coast isn't going to have, or Northern California may have something, other communities. So we just want to look at culture as the lenses through which we see and experience the world, basically. And I really like that kind of little summary of it. But we want to ask you all in the question box, we just want to ask you, do you have other suggestions of what culture means to you that we could add to our discussion here? And maybe you could just type it in, because maybe there's something we've missed of different cultures that you immediately think of that you could share with us right now. So I'm looking at the question box. Somebody said food. Okay, she's thinking of an aspect of culture. Okay, right. Somebody else said food and clothing, dressing certain ways. Okay, these are all parts of culture. Exactly. Philosophical beliefs. Okay, very good. Okay, well, as we move on, somebody said food, customs, ethics. Yes. Thank you. I think that gives us a little broader idea of culture, and as we move on here, we're going to look at it a little more in depth. So this page, John's going to talk about it.
Thank you very much, Carol. So as we start to think more about culture, it's important that we consider the various social and historical contexts which may influence a person's cultural identity and their attitudes towards mental health services. These variables may subsequently impact one's reluctance towards seeking mental health services. It may tell you a little bit more about how medicine is thought of in a community, and it might be a good key into how stigma is conceptualized within a community. Now, these variables can all be influencing one another. They may impact individuals with certain combinations of these influences. So just because everyone, may have had past negative experiences with mental health services, the way they conceptualize mental health, even if they shared a similar negative experience, that lens of culture can kind of change or show how these different kind of aspects of identity are shaped. So individuals' level of acculturation or biculturalism, acculturation being the process of which someone learns another culture or learns and adopts new cultural practices, something that it is, we would say, is common amongst immigrant communities. That level of acculturation is combined with maybe individuals' immigration status. It could be combined with trauma they've experienced back home. Conversely, someone's racial identity mixed with their own housing status may impact how they perceive mental health services. And trying to better understand how all of these different variables interact and the outcomes that they can have for people is an important part of being in the right kind of mental headset to think about how to offer culturally competent services. So we've mentioned that a few times. So what exactly is cultural competency? So NAMI would define cultural competency as a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system among professionals that enable them to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. So basically what they're saying is it's a set of practices that are put in place that allow agencies, groups of people, organizations, allow them to be more flexible in how they respond to the differences and to the nuances of culture when it comes to serving different communities in an effective and humble manner. A good foundation for cultural competency can include things like having bilingual staff, or materials and brochures that are translated into other languages in English. And that's not always enough. It may also mean going out into the community, becoming familiar with practices, celebrations of different communities that are different from your own, so that you can better offer those services or better perform outreach in an informed manner. Cultural competence is a couple of things. It is an ongoing practice. You don't ever just achieve cultural competence and then you're good, you're done. It's not like paying into a savings account and kind of meeting that target number and being done. Cultural competence is a constantly ongoing process. It involves constantly re-examining your organization's policies, the beliefs of individual employees. It is not stereotyping or trying to use these simple stereotypes to understand cultures, or trying to understand different communities in ways that are not actually representative or could even be harmful. It is not only race and ethnicity, even though oftentimes discussions around cultural competence typically involve discussions around race or ethnicity. They are not the same thing. Culture and race are definitely separate things. Cultural competence implies an awareness of one's own preconceptions and biases. As mentioned earlier, it's a very human thing to have these preconceived ideas, to have these unconscious biases. And just having them in and of itself does not mean you're not culturally competent. It's more so not being aware that you may have these biases, or not feeling comfortable enough to challenge your own preconceived notions. That is where the issue of a lack of cultural competence becomes more apparent. It requires a recognition of the impact of your organization's assumptions and practices. So it means being aware of what policies you have that could be harmful, that are beneficial, or could be improved in a way to reach more individuals or to create a more inclusive environment. And finally, cultural competence should recognize and honor and validate the differences and similarities between people. So what exactly does cultural competency entail? So it's part of these 5 key kind of features, and these features all work together in a continuously self-informing process. Again, if we mention that cultural competency is an ongoing process, it means that we have multiple components that have to be continuously updated as new information becomes available, or different people need training, or situations change. Again, a big part of cultural competency involves that ability that your organization is adaptable. So to begin with, we'll start with cultural self-awareness. So this is an understanding the assumptions and values upon which our own behavior and worldview rest. So understanding the context that have kind of molded our own thoughts. That's kind of the first step, being culturally self-aware there. Self-awareness is important since these values and assumptions are ingrained, almost built into our worldview, and they affect how we perceive ourselves and the rest of the world. They affect how we assign value to different components, to things like people's personality or their work ethic. To every interaction we have with other people, we are going to bring these own preconceptions about them, about people that are not within our own cultural in-group, individuals that might be outside of our culture. We may assume that the other, quote unquote, is just like us, or that he or she is different and that we can never understand them. These preconceptions can impact our expectations, behaviors, and communication styles. As I mentioned earlier, as much as we would like to think that we are all culturally sensitive and informed, we all have biases, and the self-awareness allows us to at least be conscious of them. In that same vein, we must be aware of the other cultural context. This encompasses a wide range of elements, including but not limited to race, ethnicity, country of origin, language, level of acculturation, gender, religious belief, sexual orientation, age, spiritual beliefs, socioeconomic status, and education. So again, a very, very large kind of list of variables that are all feeding into this central idea of culture or identity. 3, we need an understanding of the dynamics of this difference. So how do these differences in different cultural valuations for usually some of the same kind of concepts, the same ideas of wealth or the same ideas of education or shame or privilege, how do these differences in how these worldviews were built up in these cultures, how do they interact? 4, it leads us into the development of cultural knowledge. To be culturally competent, we must first familiarize ourselves with the cultures that exist in our area. The changing demographic characteristics of the U.S. can make it very difficult to be knowledge about all of the potential groups in our communities. As a first step, we should attempt to first become familiar with the groups that we encounter most often, at least 1 or 2 of the more commonly encountered groups. Cultural knowledge would include knowing about the views on family, daily living, intergenerational issues, culturally acceptable behaviors, the role of religion, and all of this can eventually feed into how different communities, how their beliefs about mental illness and mental health treatment occur. And that leads us to the final set, and that's the ability to adapt and to practice these skills. So we need to assess the cultural context of others and make changes and adaptations to fit them. For example, we have to attend to nonverbal and verbal cues and interpret them within the appropriate cultural context. So I'll give just 2 examples. One is kind of the stock example that mainstream Western individuals, Anglo-Saxons particularly, when it comes to speaking to others in the West and in the United States specifically, eye contact is a pretty important kind of cultural feature. It conveys these ideas that the speaker is to be trusted. They look you in the eye. This person obviously is telling us something important and truthful, whereas individuals who are not meeting your gaze, maybe they have something to hide or they do not feel confident in what they are saying. This can be a completely different concept in other cultures where an eye contact is very not heavily regulated, but it's more reserved. So for example, you may not make direct eye contact or for extended periods of time with people that may occupy a different social kind of group than you, or based on age or gender. A good example I have from my personal life, prior to working for NAMI California, I worked for an organization, the International Rescue Committee. And what they did is they helped to support refugees, asylee seekers, victims of human trafficking, individuals like this, they seek to support in the United States by providing things like employment services and housing assistance. When I was first starting at that job, I was just a brand new intern. I didn't have a lot of responsibility, and a lot of what my day-to-day looked like was helping to take new immigrants, particularly from Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq, to medical appointments or dental appointments, something to this effect. One day, I was picking up a gentleman, an older gentleman, and I just made one kind of social faux pas after the other. I didn't take my shoes off before I went into their home. When I should have known better, I offered to shake hands with the mother of the family, an older lady from Afghanistan. And within their culture, that is a fairly inappropriate thing to do, to touch or to have like a physical contact with a stranger, specifically a strange man. And for me, as a man, to be offering her to shake my hand, kind of put her in an uncomfortable situation. And I didn't even think about it. I'm an American. We shake hands with everybody. You just met someone new. Oh, hi, how are you doing? And it was just like almost like an unconscious thing. And to have been more aware of that situation, I could have been a more culturally humble, more culturally competent individual for that person. So with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and break down these 5 kind of components. And I think for this part, I'm going to turn it over to Carol.
Okay, thanks for sharing that, John. That was very interesting and a beautiful example of our need for cultural awareness. So thank you. So you all today were able to go over the first part of the cultural competence that we showed you, the culturals, and with these individuals here on the slide. And hopefully this process enabled you to understand a little bit more of your own assumptions or your own values that you view the world from. That's the way we all start, with our own assumptions and our own values, and that's the way we tend to view the rest of the world. And so with this little exercise that John had us do, we came to see that sometimes we have preconceptions about people, and that can impact our expectations for them, and it can impact our behaviors, even our communication styles. So the point here is that we all have to be aware of our biases and our preconceptions. If we want to think of ourselves as culturally sensitive, we have to start with ourselves and see what biases and what preconceptions we have. So it's real important for us to have self-awareness and to know ourselves in this area. So let's go on to the next slide, and we're going to talk a little bit about a topic that has an interesting title, cultural humility. I really like that because, often we don't think of humility as a value, but with cultures, other cultures, working with other cultures and living with other cultures, we need cultural humility. So here's some ways that 5 points here to become more culturally self-aware of our own cultures. Number 1, be aware of your own cultural heritage and value the differences of others. So you're aware of your own, but instead of looking down on others or feeling superior, we value the differences of others. Number 2, become more aware of your own values and biases so that you can also be aware of how they might affect those whom you serve. So, if I know I have a certain bias about how certain people dress, for example, I'm so sorry, my throat is bothering me, but there we go. If we're aware of our biases, then we can make an effort. We can exercise our will, in a sense, to drop those biases and look at other people objectively, so that we don't, it doesn't affect the way we work with them. in a negative way. So real important to become aware of our own biases. 3, work to strengthen your comfort level surrounding the differences of others from cultures not of your own. Okay, really, really excellent work to strengthen your comfort level with other cultures. My husband and I were talking the other day about how, you know, as older people, how the world has changed for one thing, but even how we grew up. And I'll just tell you that I spent the first 10 years of my life in a small town in the middle of the prairie in Kansas. And it was 8,000 people. And my grandparents and all my aunts and uncles were wheat farmers. And in that little town, there were not very much diversity at all. And, you know, when I was in 6th grade, my mom wanted to move to California. She met my dad in California, and she fell in love with California, and she begged and begged my dad to move her to California. So, you know, we got out here, things were different. You know, that expression, it's not for nothing, you're not in Kansas anymore. There's a lot of diversity here. And over the years, I wouldn't say I was uncomfortable being here, but there's such an opportunity in this state to just work to strengthen our comfort levels. We have so much diversity, and it's such a blessing, really, to work with, you know, right at our jobs, to work with so many different kinds of people and different cultures and different religions, and really get to know people and learn how they think, and you know, kind of find what we have in common as well as how we're different. So going on to number 4, strengthen your sensitivity to valuing others' perspective. So again, we want to value others' perspective rather than judging them because they don't think like we do. We want to learn about their perspective and how they view the world. And the last point, acknowledge your attitudes and beliefs regarding people of other cultures. So it starts with changes can start when we acknowledge that we have certain prejudices, you might say, or preconceptions about people of other cultures, and to recognize it and to name it. And in the end, this will help us to open up. We just have to, first of all, recognize our own lacks in that area. So I really like this title, Cultural Humility. And I'm going to turn it now back over to John to talk about diversity.
I would actually just add that a lot of people that kind of specialize and work within this sector, this field, this idea of making organizations more culturally competent, the language is starting to shift to cultural humility in general. Like you're starting to see more people say that, you know, the county behavioral health department's cultural humility plan over the cultural competency plan. So just something to keep about, you know, the ever-changing notion of language. Another important key point of cultural competency includes diversity, being aware of it, respecting diversity, understanding how your organization interacts with it, if they are promoting diversity or in that context. So it's important to be aware that each and all of us exist within a cultural context. Attention to cultural details and knowledge will help us to successfully engage and help individuals and families from backgrounds other than our own. So NAMI's definition of diversity is diversity encompasses the understanding, respecting, embracing, preserving, and celebrating experiences and perspectives that are different from our own. This definition includes every possible type of diversity, from race and ethnicity to sexual orientation and gender, religion, and socioeconomic status. Again, because it's important to keep in mind that diversity goes well beyond race and ethnicity. And so I would simply like to ask a question to everyone right now is, do you agree with this definition, or would you want to include or make any other additions? Feel free just to message us in the questions section, and we can kind of share and discuss as a class other ideas relating around diversity that we might want to include, or if we have some types of perspectives that maybe we're not including. Okay, so I got a few people within our group overall agree with this assessment of diversity in an organization. Great, great. I don't think there's anyone who might want to add, which is that's fine too. With that in mind, then we're going to talk a little bit about what organizations can do to value diversity. If you want to jump in, Carol.
Oh, okay. Okay, so it's important to value diversity within our communities. In other words, celebrate it, value it. So here's some ways that we can do that. First of all, we can be aware, and we can broaden our general knowledge of groups and cultures. And, I'm just thinking offhand, okay, how do we do that? Well, if you read widely is helpful. Any kind of book. Sometimes you can read about different cultures. You can read novels and learn about different cultures. My favorite, of course, is to travel. I'm very, very big on travel, and I always have been. I just love it because I just get to, and I tell my husband, I want to go someplace that's not like here. I just love to see something different with different culture, different people, different dress, different food, everything about it. So we want to broaden our awareness of cultures, other groups and cultures. Secondly, include others. Have a variety of people involved in your groups and activities. Yes, that's very, very good as well. Don't stick with the same cultural group all the time, but invite a variety of people. Just an example, sometimes we like to go down to Mission Bay here in San Diego, and we like to have a campfire, and there's these fire pits right around the bay, and I've invited people from NAMI before, and it's so fun because sometimes there's a wide variety of people, and it's just a great opportunity to get together with others. 3, never assume. Never assume. That's really good. Ask questions. Listen carefully and check your understanding. Never assume that they celebrate this or they don't celebrate that or whatever. Never assume, but inquire respectfully. And people are often interested in talking and sharing about their culture. So, I think inquiring in an interested way, in a positive way, can be very, very helpful. Number 4, have respect. Treat all people fairly, honestly, and with positive regard. Yes, always have a positive attitude, never a negative attitude, never. Just always have a positive attitude, an inquiring mind, and interest, curiosity. Isn't that a wonderful word? Curiosity about other people and other cultures will get you a long way. And the last point, openly communicate. Share information, share expectations, and unwritten rules with everyone. So if you're working in this field, and you're talking to clients, sometimes we may assume certain things that we may assume they know, and we need to communicate and not always assume they know anything about, say, what the expectations of a behavioral health clinic are. So we just want to make sure that when we're working with them, we're clear with them. Like if they have a doctor's appointment coming up, and it's kind of what comes to mind just is the fact that there's doctor's offices typically call you a day or two ahead of time to remind you about an appointment here. That's generally how things are done. Other cultures may not be aware of that. They might, who knows how they would respond to that, but I'm just saying, in working with people and talking to them about doctor's appointments, that's something you just can help make them aware of in case they're not surprised. So there's just lots and lots of different ways to value diversity, and it's something we really want to work on. And moving on to the next slide. The question is, what is cultural responsiveness? So a part of being culturally competent is being culturally responsive. So what does that mean? That refers to the ability to, the first verb over here, learn from other cultures. Be interested, be curious about it, and learn from them. Maybe they have some excellent ideas about things or ways of doing things that we've never thought of. And it also is the ability to relate, the second point here, respectfully to people from your own culture and from other cultures. We always want to relate respectfully. Very, very important in being culturally competent. Treat people with dignity, respect them, honor them. Culturally responsive care, here's the definition: the ability of individuals and systems to respond respectfully and effectively to all people of all cultures in a manner that affirms the worth and preserves the dignity of individuals, families, and communities. And, you know, talking about in the previous slide about broadening ourselves, I just give a little example too of something that I've done in the past, because I've always been interested in learning about people that aren't like me. But when my kids were in high school, I hosted, the first year I hosted a young girl from Japan. You know, sometimes you'll get these phone calls. Somebody's in charge of finding host homes for a group of, this was a group of high school students arriving. This was when I lived in Portland, Oregon, and spending the summer in Portland in the United States. So I hosted a girl from Japan, and that was fascinating. And she was, you know, that's their first time here. And, you know, she was like big eyes at our culture. But it was such a wonderful exchange of caring and interest in each other's cultures. And then another thing I did, one year, when my younger daughter was in high school, I hosted an exchange student for a whole year for her senior year, and she was from Spain. And that was fun also. I remember her walking into our house and showing her around the house and opening the back door. And she had lived her whole life on the 6th floor of a high-rise in downtown Madrid. And we opened the back door, and she said, "A backyard!" And we had a very large backyard. We had 1/3 of an acre, and she was just blown away because she had never lived in a house before with a backyard. But I was interested in her culture and in Spain and how they have these long dinners every night, you know, and they're eating, they eat late, but they eat, you know, until 11 or midnight at night. And that was fascinating to learn about that. So that's just little examples of different ways that we all can go about our lives and find ways to learn and broaden our knowledge about other cultures and our cultural competency. So next slide. Next slide is, how will being culturally responsive as a family and peer support specialist help others? Okay, that's a good question for us. How will this help others? Well, if we start at the bottom of the staircase here, it will help increase their access to getting the care they need, because often other cultures sometimes are underserved or unserved communities. You know, they don't know where to go for behavioral health care or even regular medical care. And as we are aware of their culture and then what we have to offer to help them, we can increase their access to be able to get the help they need. Going up the ladder here, it will increase the quality of program services, because we're kind of the liaison, the go-between between our clients in maybe other cultures and the behavioral health system out there, the clinics, the doctor's offices, all the different services that are out there. And so we're kind of the liaison, and we can help increase the quality if we give our feedback. Hey, my clients need this, and that can help other agencies step up to provide more better quality services. The next point is it will increase the credibility in the community, including the possibility of more collaboration with diverse organizations, right? Again, we're the go-between, and, as we share about our clients' needs everywhere we go and within even our own agency, then that's where the work can begin to, okay, how can we meet these people's needs? So there can be more collaboration, or maybe there's another agency that's more able to meet their needs but is not aware of it. Then that increases our collaboration. We call them up and say, we've got these clients that have these needs, could you help us? Just offhand, I'm thinking of like Mental Health Systems here in San Diego has an office that helps people get employment. NAMI doesn't have that, but maybe I come across some clients that are looking for a job. Then as a support specialist, I need to collaborate with Mental Health Systems to get the help for my clients. So definitely our being culturally responsive is going to help people. And finally, you will have success in helping the family member and or the peer that is going through their recovery. You will be much more able to help them because you're aware of their culture and you're respectful of their culture, and you using everything you know to help them come to the best outcomes and get into recovery. So it's very, very important. And, NAMI, as John said earlier, NAMI partners with UPAC. When I first worked for Hope Connections down here as a program of NAMI in San Diego County, well, other agency that hired people for that program was UPAC, Union of Pan Asian Communities. So this partnering with different cultures is very important. And another example is NAMI doing family-to-family classes in different languages. In Vietnamese, I understand that here in San Diego they do family-to-family in Vietnamese once a year. And in El Cajon, a suburb out east here, there's a large community of people from Iraq, and they do a family-to-family in Arabic. So it's real important that we be culturally responsive, and we can really, really help people in the end. So I'm going to turn it back over to John.
Yes, ma'am. Wonderful stuff, Carol. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about inclusion, what that means to you, and kind of that general definition. So before I jump into giving NAMI's definition, why don't we all hear from everyone on the call tonight? Why don't you go ahead and send us in your definition of inclusion? We'll see how similar that is to ours, to the kind of policy NAMI standard definition for inclusion. Give us an idea of how you all think about it. So if you just want to message your idea of inclusion or what inclusion means to you, it doesn't necessarily need to be a definition, and then we'll share the NAMI definition. So I think some people are just typing up right now some ideas. So a couple very short kind of like sound bites for our definitions. So everyone always is one definition. Being included within the group, to be informed. Someone gave an example. This would be family to family in Mandarin in the Bay Area. To be belonging or being included, involving everyone unconditionally. That's a pretty excellent one. And again, it's echoed, accepting all individuals regardless of differences. Okay, so we're on some pretty similar tracks. Let me go ahead and stop everyone there. Let me just share NAMI's definition of inclusion. We'll see how similar they are. So NAMI says that their definition of inclusion is when diverse communities are meaningfully engaged in an organization An inclusive organization is a safe, trusting environment in which everyone feels they belong and have an equally empowering experience. Inclusion involves self-determination, and this means power sharing. So making sure that these ideas of power, that power dynamics are acknowledged, and that individuals are front and center in the decision-making process for that group. That would be inclusion, making sure people feel safe, that they are recognized, and that their input is meaningful when it comes to the decision-making of an organization or other kind of decisions within your group. So from there, we're going to talk a little bit more about these levels of diversity and inclusion. So take a minute to kind of read through these key points on the screen in front of you. So these are all kind of thought experiment examples in which you might want to think about yourself in the context of your future family or peer support role. Would you feel comfortable, when someone who is African American, if they came into your office, how would they feel comfortable? What would you do? What would be in your office for that? Same thing goes with individuals who may have different immigration statuses, or they may have a mental illness. They may be very young. They may be very old. They may not be a sexual orientation. They may be transgendered. All these different types of ideas, all these different types of identities. What would you be doing in these contexts? So again, those are some key points to think about. And this sometimes can be an opportunity to just ask when you're in this situation yourself. Maybe you don't know exactly what you would need to do to have your office space set up to make sure that you're welcoming individuals from the Latino community. And so think about what questions you might want to ask when it comes to cultural humility, when it comes to customs that would allow you to be a better support specialist, right? So we have some people some of our students suggesting that all you really need to do is listen. Be ready to listen and apply what you learn in your work life. Correct. So with that in mind, I'm going to transition over to Carol, and she'll talk a little bit more about what families, or what you can do to address peers and families in a competent. Hello, Carol. You still on the line with me?
Sorry, I forgot to click my button. Thank you very much. Yeah, what can I do to address peers and families in a culturally competent manner? So after understanding my own culture, then I just need to develop, and I need to have that understanding of my own culture and develop that self-awareness. But then I need to be able to move into being more aware of other people's cultures. And so here's some basic categories of other cultures. They often have their own traditions, okay? So as we work with people, we definitely should become aware of what's important to them. What are their traditions? What are their holidays? Or how do they celebrate special days? To me, that's part of traditions. How they do a marriage ceremony, maybe that's a tradition. One time I went to a wedding. I went to the wedding reception of a couple from India, and the dancing was different. That was part of their tradition. So that's just an example. We have to be aware of their beliefs. If it's a religious culture, then they would have certain beliefs. If it's a nationality, they might have certain ways of looking at the world. Languages, then what languages are spoken there? Is it just one language where they're from, or is it multiple languages? That can make a difference. And then consider social and historical context. So you want to look at, my older daughter actually also worked for the same organization that John worked for. She worked for International Rescue Committee, and she drove people. What she did, she drove people around to help them get jobs, and they were new immigrants in San Diego from Sudan mainly, and there was a group called the Lost Boys of Sudan that were, grew up in a United Nations refugee camp. But if she met and she helped a couple of those guys that were what was called the Lost Boys, she had to understand their social and what they had been through. That's the historical context, because those boys had crossed rivers and deserts and everything to get out of Sudan when there was a civil war, and they made a long journey over to Kenya to the United Nations refugee camp to be safe, and their parents were killed and everything. And so to work with them, she had to be really aware of what they had been through, their history, their personal history, to have fully an amount of empathy and an understanding of their thinking and where they came from. So that's just a major example. So diverse cultures have different ideas, they have different beliefs, they have different values, and they also, what we need to be aware is that they often have a lot of different information regarding mental health. And so it's very important. If, for example, if you're a support specialist and you're working with a client, you have to be even, cautiously inquiring to them how they feel about getting treatment for mental health or whatever is the issue at the time, to respectfully inquire and try to get to know them, because they may have a totally different viewpoint than we do. And it's important too, when you're working with somebody like that, to keep progress notes. You will, working for an agency, you'll be keeping notes on all your clients, but you want to jot down their needs and their particular viewpoints and things. So if somebody has to step in when you're out one day and work with that client, they can read the notes and they don't have to start from square one to get to know that person. So really, really important to keep all this in mind when you're working with people. And also, here's a little cautionary tale. You know how we say we want to get to know cultures and we want to understand them and everything, but I'm going to give the balance on the other end then. So a lot of times, as we're learning about cultures, we may pick up some stereotypes. So we want to make sure that we don't do that either. Just an off-the-wall example is, what if we worked with some people from Ireland and we got the idea that they always wear green. So that's a stereotype, but and then we walk into a family and they're not wearing green. So that's going to, blow our theory, right? So we have to realize there's no canned component about what different cultures do, because individuals are different. So we have to be responsive to the individual needs of whoever we're working with the cultural differences in mind, but don't always assume that they're going to reflect that culture hook, line, and sinker, you might say. And here's an example. Imagine preparing to visit or meet an individual from the Latino community. Okay, so you're preparing to visit, and you take all the Spanish materials from your office that you can, and you maybe even bring along a translator and everything. And then you get there, you're not aware that they're the second generation. They were born in this country. They speak only English. So you go there and you find out they speak English, and all this preparation you did was for naught. You didn't even bring the English material. So again, we have to be culturally aware, but we also have to be aware we're working with individuals, and we don't want to just assume too much. So we have to be prepared for different situations that come up. We have to be flexible. We have to be prepared to learn new things from people. And that's the joy of this occupation, I would say, is you learn so many new things. So let us move on to the next slide. And I really love this example, cultivating relationships. So as you start to be aware of other people's culture, then you start to understand the dynamics of the differences. There's differences. And through this process, you learn about individuals and you get to know people and you make friends, so to speak. And so this is where cultivating relationships come in. And I just love this example I'm going to show you, because when we think of cultivating, we look at this picture of a cornfield. And what do you need to cultivate the corn? You need time, for sure. You need patience. You need all the right resources. You need the sun, you need the rain, you need the irrigation or whatever. And you need constant efforts. You need to be there monitoring the situation, because unexpected events can happen. Like there might be a drought, the rain might not come, or there might be too much rain, or there might be pesticides just taking over the crop, grasshoppers or something. So that's the way it is when we're cultivating a relationship with people, which is basically what we're doing when we're working as a support specialist. You want to try to develop a sense of connectedness with another person. In a sense, you want to find your things in common. You want to be interested in their culture, but you want to find out what you have in common to build a bond there as well. And what does that take? It takes time. You're not going to do that on the first visit, but it's a start. And so it takes time and patience, and it takes effort, and it takes, putting in the effort to get to know them, to share your own experiences and listen to them back and enjoy communicating with them. And then sometimes you have to prepare for the unexpected. Sometimes things maybe won't go as well as you hoped. But, when they can connect with you, what's going to happen is just going to lead to more open conversations. And the more open conversations you have, you'll be able to understand where they're coming from, and you'll be able to understand their perspectives. And that way, and that gaining that understanding, you will be able to help them in ways that they can receive, because we want to be careful. We're not trying to help them in ways that they don't want to receive. So we have to understand where they're at, meet them where they're at. And that's why it's so important to connect. So turning it back over to John.
Excellent lesson, Carol. Excellent. So kind of in that same line, as we think about how to prepare and how to work and to outreach into diverse communities, we're going to talk a little bit more about how to set up that communication channel. So you have kind of an order of events on the screen in front of you associated with that arrow, beginning with, taking the step to first learning about the community, the individual you're going to work with, understanding your own organization's motivation to do that outreach, and then actually establishing that communication. So for that first step, it's important to do what you can to learn about the background, interests, cultural dynamics as much as possible. Ask around, do research. Usually you can even check in with your county. Most counties, as part of their mandate, their Health and Human Services Department are required to have a cultural competency team. So that might be a good way to learn more about the demographics of, for example, your county and some of how that interplay is understood. And this is advised to do your research because all communities are going to have slightly different customs and traditions, not to mention the intersection of those different cultural aspects, as well as history and race, gender, all of those different intersections. It's just going to be that much more important to have that understanding of each individual community. So once you have done some of that research, then you want to start thinking about what may motivate this community to want to enter into a relationship with you, and as well as what is the motivation within your organization to do this type of outreach. Do you have support from your superiors, from management, from people in key decision-making vehicles? Is that going to be worthwhile? Are they committed? as well as is the community that you want to reach out to establish this connection. Are they committed? Do you have people that can work as networks, as gatekeepers to help you into that process? It's important to ask yourself, what do these communities gain by talking with you? Once you feel confident, then you can begin the process of establishing communication. This can take place with an individual or with a group, and aim to meet them in a place that makes them feel comfortable. Be aware that certain locations may not be appropriate meeting places, and you should be flexible as you try to accommodate individuals. By keeping that in mind, you are starting that first step of establishing that communication. And from there, we can talk about building trust in that relationship, which I believe Carol will elaborate on a little bit more.
Okay. Here's over here on the side on the right, voices from the community. I go to the doctor and he says there's nothing wrong with me. I feel that the doctor doesn't understand me. Okay, so that's a participant from Latino Farm Worker, a session that someone expressed their problems getting care. So we need to understand that sometimes different people have negative past experiences, and whole communities can have this, and so diverse communities may have a hard time trusting outsiders, and they might be a little wary of you, even as a support specialist, trying to offer them support. They're just got their guard up. So it's not surprising that sometimes that happens, and they're used to prejudice and bias and discriminations from others that are not culturally competent. So we just have to be aware of this as well, because a real important part of our engagement with people is we want to build trust within a community or with individuals. We really want to build trust, because they won't be able to receive help from us if we don't. So how do we build trust? We need to learn about their culture, as we've been saying all along, and even the little nuances of it. And we need to learn about their concerns as a culture, and any issues that they identify. We need to see what their concerns are and their issues that maybe need to be fixed, so that we can help them. And we can't expect that a community will want to receive our help right away. They may have their guard up. So we have to be really aware of that and work carefully, have patience. Sometimes it takes time. An example of building trust is, here's an example from a peer support person from NAMI, Los Angeles, and she attended a Spanish support group despite the inability to speak and understand Spanish. But she went there. She wanted to show that she supported that community. She was working with a lot of Spanish-speaking individuals, and so she wanted to learn as much as she could so she went out of her way to go to the Spanish support group and even learn a few words of the language, at least greeting, and at least please and thank you. Just learning a little bit of the language, if we're working with a particular group of people, it can go a long ways. So she just went out of her way to learn about it and get familiar with the community. So by doing this, what happened, she became more culturally competent, and she was better able to serve the community. And sometimes we do things like that. We just go out of our way to educate ourselves, basically, make ourselves better prepared as support specialists. So turning it back over to John.
So with that in mind, we're going to talk a little bit more about some different potential roadblocks that we should keep in mind as we think to outreach into diverse communities and to make our own organizations more inclusive. So the text on front of you simply is talking about the NAMI Star Center, associated with the National Organization for NAMI, conducted a national survey, and they identified that people in recovery who do and do not use peer support, and members of racial and ethnic groups, when they were asked why they weren't in a peer program, many of the participants from non-white backgrounds expressed concerns about not feeling understood or accepted, and even those who do use peer support feel that those peer programs are not always respectful towards their cultural beliefs and values. And if they would like to speak up against that, they usually do not, for fear of rocking the boat, quote unquote, by openly expressing their cultural views and lifestyles. So this is important to keep in mind. This is a kind of research done on NAMI's programs in general. Many of us on the call tonight likely have maybe attended a support group or family-to-family class. Maybe we facilitated one. We've had maybe some type of interaction with those NAMI programs. And so just based on this information alone, we know that some of those programs are not meeting the expectations that we have for them to be inclusive organizations, to be one that seeks to make sure that all people feel heard and are safe and are receiving the support and help they need to get through their mental health challenges. So if we are, even if we are open to everyone, people from these diverse backgrounds still fear being misunderstood, being discriminated against, and being stigmatized or disrespected. And this fear can be present even without us knowing it. This is, usually not something that organizations do on purpose, but it is still something that we should identify and address. So I think Carol is going to talk a bit more about the roadblocks regarding diverse recovery.
Okay. So if, let's say, we're working with a number of people in a specific community who've had this experience that John's talking about. They just haven't felt respected, haven't felt like there's any kind of services for them, that people acknowledge them. And so we've got a roadblock there. And so we have an important role to play in helping people. And for recovery to be successful for anyone, for an individual, or in a certain community, it has to be, our recovery and our efforts have to be aligned with their cultures and their customs and their beliefs. And when that happens, we will have the ability to interact effectively with people of different cultures. But if we have a roadblock, we're acknowledging a roadblock, and sometimes this will come up in your agency meeting where you all meet together, whatever agency you might work for. Like, we had a weekly meeting when I worked for Hope Connections, and to talk about our challenges. So let's just say there's a roadblock there. You're working with this community, but you can't quite get through. A real key thing that can be really helpful, as it says here on the slide, is to speak to people from the target population and search out and find out who the leaders are. This says speak with tribal leaders in the Native American communities, but it could be the leadership in any community. There's always those who are kind of in the lead and who are the kind of key people. I'm thinking of the Chaldean community in El Cajon, and there's a lot of these Chaldean Christians that have come from Iraq, and there are key church leaders there. There's another man that kind of represents their community as a spokesperson, and we can learn how to address these roadblocks if we can, be bold enough to talk to some of in the leadership, and or if we know anyone who's members there, and address some of these issues with those people in that community that have some influence. So sometimes it's important to reach out to churches and other places of worship and find the representatives, whether it's African American community or whether it's Latino, whether it's Iraqi, whatever it is. We want to speak to key people in this targeted population and outreach to them. And sometimes that can really, really help us to break through. Sometimes it's spiritual leaders, it's business people, it might be service providers, others. So we get information, we create bonds within that community as we reach out to their leadership, and it helps us get to know them, and it helps them open up and be willing to not be, drop their past experience and open up to seeing if we can help them. So here's a community example. Allowing the community to determine what efforts and decisions they want to make will allow them to take ownership of their community, which may have been taken away by others in the past. So that's why we want to contact them and let them choose, make choices of how they want to get help. The community or individuals will identify the goals they decide and that they deemed are important. And an example here is NAMI Contra Costa has allowed a little more flexibility in they have a family-to-family program in Spanish, in Familia a Familia, to better engage Latino participants. And so they changed it slightly. We're a little more flexible to fit the needs of that community, but they were still abiding by the required expectations from NAMI National for that program. But we have to be flexible, and we have to reach out. Again, as it says here on the slide, LGBTQ communities, it will require a broader sweep. That's just because they don't necessarily all live in the same neighborhood. And so that may require a different approach. But those are just two examples of how we can address the roadblocks and kind of break through some of these things that create barriers for us. Turning it back over.
Yes, ma'am. Excellent point, Carol. Thank you. So another additional roadblock to think about as we set up services and try and outreach into communities include accessible location. So some things as you kind of think about, is there a location that we'd like to meet at? Is it a well-known, acceptable place to meet at? Is public transportation available, or do the individual we're seeking to meet, do they have transportation there and back home in a convenient manner? And think about some potential challenges, including lack of parking, inopportune times during the day, or maybe a lack of handicap accessible buildings. Some other kind of research I would like to point everyone towards when it comes to thinking about accessibility and location. So research would actually suggest that treatment options are less available in ethnic, racial minority, and low-income communities. So I have the study right up there, the one by Guerrero and Cao. There's also a separate study that was done in 2017 by some researchers over at California Lutheran University. And they concluded that licensed mental health professionals tend to be concentrated in wealthier, whiter, older, and more educated regions of the state. And they were able to do that by they took data from the California Board of Psychology and Board of Behavioral Health Sciences and compared that to U.S. Census data. And were able to kind of demonstrate that geographically, these, the data would show that these differences exist. We have the actual study right there, the citation by Shorma et al. If you would like either one of these full studies, you have the link to the Guerrero study, but I can also send you the other one if you'd be so interested. So here I will turn it over to Carol so that we can talk a bit more about these culturally competent services and what that means.
Okay, so we're still addressing the roadblocks, and here over the quote over here on the right kind of sums it up. We need services not only in our language, but also in our culture to address the disconnect between doctors and patients. And so, we're hoping that actually more and more clinics, doctors, therapists, and you know, we appreciate that they're getting cultural competency training as well, because it's so important. We want to offer services not just in their language, but we want to have services that are responsive and respectful to their beliefs about their health, the practices that they have about their health, and even their cultural and their the needs. Maybe they have a very diverse group of people. Maybe they don't all speak the same language, or there's different dialects. So we have to be aware of that and respectful of that. And especially as our country gets more and more diverse, we need to really capitalize on this and be respectful and knowledgeable about different beliefs and practices. And secondly, we need to actively address diversity in how we deliver the services. So maybe some variety of services. Maybe they can't, you know, maybe it's transportation, as John said, or maybe they can't receive in a certain way. Maybe there's another way to present the services. So we need some diversity in that. And we need to seek to reduce the disparities in access to health care, so that everybody has equal access and everybody has positive outcomes. And it's not just all positive for the mainstream group, but the smaller groups also have access and have very positive outcomes. And some focus groups have addressed this issue, and usually more than half the participants always say that there, of course, needs to be services in their language. So but we need so much more than that. So that's a roadblock. So when we get culturally competent, our services will expand. There will be more variety, more access, more diversity, more ability to meet the needs of all different kinds of people. So moving on.
Couldn't have said it better, Carol. So for here, we have a simple kind of thought experiment to think about as how it might be for you in your potential role as a peer support specialist in the future. So want everyone to kind of stop, think, ask yourselves, what would you do in a situation where you don't have NAMI brochures or other materials translated into the languages of those you're trying to outreach to? What are some things you can do to kind of overcome that? Some strategies you might be able to think about so that you can provide the most culturally competent services available. You send that to our questions comment. We'll share and discuss those different ideas and then leave you with some of our own suggestions. Yeah, so some people, there's a variety of ways that you can translate your materials. You could use something like Google Translate. I would encourage you to use this for small scale translation. So I'd be kind of wary of trying to translate, large complex documents. It's also important to keep in mind that Google Translate may not adequately translate, and the topics that we're going to be talking about, things like mental health, things like, treatment options, medications, schizophrenia. These types of things may not be something that translates well via Google. So just make sure that if you do want to test that out, I would advise you to have a member of the community that's kind of a partner that you can run some of the translations by first. That would be a good rule if you're going to do some of your own self-translation. You could definitely follow up with people, so you could take some information down and reach out to them, possibly after you've received those materials, maybe by going to NAMI National or that website. Right, and some other people have kind of had similar experiences where Google Translate have not always been able to translate. Some people mentioned the courts, though your courts may not offer translation services. They may have them for court cases and something, but they may not be something that's viable for your organization to reach out to get those services. And if you've ever worked with translating services in the past, they can be quite expensive. So if I'm not mistaken, Carol, I think you mentioned that our own NAMI website, the NAMI National maybe, that they self-translate. correct? Or they have a translation.
Right. I encourage you all to check that out. NAMI National, which is NAMI.org, I believe that's the correct website address. If you go on there in the upper right-hand corner, I noticed that it said Spanish, but I wondered if it translated into other languages, so I clicked on Spanish, and then I saw that there was a large number of other languages, and it asked me, so I was looking at a certain page of information, and then it asked me, you know, what language, I don't know, it gave me a choice of like, what did I want to see it in originally? I said English, and then I wanted it to translate into, and I chose Arabic. And sure enough, I clicked on Arabic, and then the whole page was in Arabic. So I was pretty impressed. So all the NAMI information on the website's available in lots of languages.
Right, and that's one way to kind of circumvent the Google process. And I'm sure they use a program like that. At least they'll have had someone go through there and confirm that those translations are accurate. So that's one way. One way to kind of overcome that kind of barrier. So with that, Miles, transition. So again, that kind of plays into what we just mentioned. Some strategies to consider. Like as we just mentioned, you can visit the website. Most of their brochures and fact sheets are translated up to date. Another strategy might be to use your connections within the NAMI network to find local affiliates that may already have inroads or have specific focuses on different communities that you want to reach out to. And then this may be a tougher one. It may involve your own individual advocacy to talk with your employer about how you can go about securing additional resources for translated material. So this might typically involve conversations surrounding funding or other initiatives. So this is a couple of things that we can do. We have another kind of thought experiment / question that we're going to go over. Carol and I can read for you. And that's something is to think about what if we don't have enough time to address our cultural responsiveness goals? So that seems to be the issue in a lot of organizations for a lot of different problems, is not having enough time to do a lot of this work. We have competing deadlines. So what are some suggestions you all have from the group, maybe in your own personal experiences or your own work, where you've been able to overcome these time limits or to try and challenge those?
I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking, what if your whole agency wants to develop sort of an outreach to, let's say, the Filipino community, but you all as support specialists, you're inundated, you're handling 10 or 15 clients a day already, and they aren't all from the Filipino community. So you're pressed for time, but your agency has this as a goal. What can you do?
So we have a couple people mentioning some strategies, trying to remain and be respectful with the individuals you're working with, trying to learn more. Yeah, that's a good starting place, of course. Organization might want to rethink your organization's capacity to be more organized. My apologies, to keep better planners or to change up your schedules so you can prioritize different issues accordingly. That's a very good suggestion. Sometimes you just have to recognize that it's going to take time. When you have different cultures all working together, maybe if it's a combination of different staff from a variety of diverse communities, as well as the clients that you're working with, you may just have to make an organizational commitment to understanding that it'll take time, that it'll be an ongoing process. Right, and when you do meet with individuals from these diverse communities, it's important to ask them what would be helpful for you to know so you could better accommodate them. I definitely agree with that, Danielle. Thank you. It might not be true of the entire group, but at least it can help you in those capacities, and it can be more helpful than not having any of that information. Okay. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and move forward with some additional strategies to consider as we try to engage multicultural communities.
Okay, I have some strategies that are going to be mentioned here on the slide for you to consider, but they are mostly strategies that you could do as a group, that in your agency, if your agency has this goal, you could work together and decide how to go about it. So think of it less of an individual thing that you would do, but something that your whole agency would do, or your whole group of support specialists together, that you want to reach out to a certain community. So the first strategy might be find a community you're already working with, and then you don't have time to address the needs of the whole community, but kind of narrow it down to just a certain group within that community to start with. So it's like, we just start small, but it's a start and gets us inroads. So it might be transitional age youth. Let's just say it's a Filipino community, but it's the transitional age youth group within there. Or it might be older adults in that group. It might be veterans. It might be LGBTQ from that same community, because you're not prepared, you can't engage with the whole community, but you can start small, start with this little subgroup. And another strategy is to develop a small concrete goal that you can bring up during your staff meetings on a monthly basis. And this will help you keep the objective in focus. So you might bring it up, like if you have a goal of, helping people in a certain community accept care for mental health needs. Maybe that's too foreign to them, they don't really recognize it, but you can bring that up at your staff meeting each time and have everyone talk about it and give some further suggestions, and you move along that line of thought for a while and you work on it. And strategy 3, find out who among your volunteers or among your staff has a certain interest in certain multicultural issues. Like some people have, their ancestors were from India or somewhere, and so they have a special interest in that community. They have very much a concern, or the Asian community or whatever, and they might be able to do something small in that community, like give a day training opportunities for people in that community to come and hear about opportunities to get support for mental health. Or they might decide to host an exhibit. Maybe the Asian community is having some kind of a fair, or the Pacific Islanders. I know here in San Diego they have a big fiesta every year. Maybe that's a place that your agency could have a table at that fair and let people know there's help for mental health out there. So a couple of success stories. NAMI Orange County obtained board approval they did hire a multicultural coordinator. Okay, so that helps a lot if you have someone in charge of it, of course. Los Angeles also had a Latino outreach coordinator, and NAMI San Diego we had an interesting experience. We hosted an event to address mental health concerns in the military, because there's such a huge presence here in San Diego. And we developed an informal advisory board of women who were in the military. And we also had a program to reach out to military families. So those are all just examples of different things you can do in a small way to reach out to different communities. So turning
strategies to keep in mind. Thank you, Carol. So kind of some things to think about as we are closing up. Some key points to keep in mind: where are we meeting with individuals? How is that meeting taking place? Or some potential roadblocks or some potential aspects of it that we didn't think about? Are they being addressed? Do we have materials available in various languages, maybe not just one language, just in case our assumptions about someone's English level is incorrect? how do we define family, and how does the community that we're seeking to work with, how do they define family? There can be very important cultural differences there. And what are we doing to show that we are friendly to all types of individuals, such as when it comes to other aspects of identity, such as gender or sexual orientation? So again, some good key points, good questions to keep in mind about as we organize our systems. A good quote that we like to share here at NAMI California, a good slogan that we incorporate is "Nothing about us without all of us." So this kind of speaks to this idea of inclusion, of equal power sharing, of recognizing that these historical balances may exist, and what we can do to make sure that everyone is part of the decision-making process, that all communities are involved, and that we're being respectful of one another's viewpoints and perspectives. So with that in mind, I would like to just kind of start wrapping up the evening. If there's any questions or comments, feel free to ask myself or Carol now. Also, make sure that you are completing those surveys that you're receiving at the end of our lessons. I know they're not mandatory. Some of you may have caught that discussion earlier in the lesson. You will receive a survey at the end of this, just asking your perceptions of the class, what we can do to improve it. Please let us know. That definitely helps us to make our program as responsive as possible. Also, keep in mind that all the handouts that were sent out in the registration email on Friday, you can find those on the right-hand side. A lot of what we talked about was drawn from these multicultural engagement guides and the Cultural Linguistic Responsiveness Toolkit, which we took excerpts out. Those are the sources we use. They're on the screen in front of you, and you also have those materials in the handouts and in the registration email sent out. So, okay. In the meantime, if no other further questions that you have, feel free to call this a good evening, and we'll meet back on Thursday night to talk about working with families and peers. And in the meantime, I'll be here to answer your questions. I believe that Carol is going to sign off for the evening.
Right. Good evening, everyone. I enjoyed visiting with you this evening. So have a good evening and a good week.
Thank you very much, Carol. Hope you continue to feel better through the week.
Thank you. I will.
Sleep. Okay, I'm just taking the time to start responding to some folks who have sent me some messages. Hey, thank you as well, Mrs. Hurtado. I appreciate your contributions for the evening. Thank you, everyone, wishing me and Carol a wonderful evening. I hope that you are all able to do the same. Hope that you all have a great evening as well. And Chandra, I was wondering if I was able to answer all of your questions. I sent you a response, but I just wanted to make sure while I have you on the line that you're receiving those registration emails. Okay, great. Okay, good. So those should be the emails that have the attachments, the registration links, as well as the recordings. All right, Chandra, have a wonderful evening. And Lisa, I was trying to respond about the classes that you were talking about. I'm not quite sure which classes you're referring to. If you just want to give me a little bit more clarification, I'd be more than happy. Oh, for family to family. Okay, so what you want to do is, what county do you live in? And we can start the process by establishing which local affiliate you want to reach out to. And that local affiliate will have their trainings posted and available, like the dates, meeting times, locations. So you live in Riverside? Okay, so you want to reach out to NAMI Mount San Jacinto. Um, do you have their contact information? I can get it to you right now if you would like. Okay. Give me one moment. I'll go ahead and get you their phone number and the website. And no worries at all. So I just sent you their phone number, or I just sent you their website address, and now I'll pull up their phone number, which might be different than what we have on their website for some reason. And I just sent you their phone number as well. So you can, I would advise you to go to their website, since the family to family trainings, they're longer, they're more in depth. They typically want people to register and fill out a small application form. It's not, don't worry about anything. You don't have to worry about being like rejected for the training. They just want to have a better understanding so they know how many trainers to have. But I mean, I would go out and check out their website tonight if you want, and they like will have that application online, and it'll tell you when their next family to family class is. And if you're interested in getting their support groups, it'll also tell you the meeting times and locations for their support groups as well. And those you don't need to be pre-registered for or anything. You can just show up for those. No worries, Miss Lisa. I hope you have a wonderful evening. And if there's no further questions, I will go ahead and sign off in the next couple of minutes. All right, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. See you all on Thursday night.